When Daniel and Lisa headed into Alaska's unforgiving wilderness for what should have been a routine hunting trip, they never imagined it would become one of the state's most haunting mysteries. While most disappearance cases leave families with nothing but questions, this one had a witness, their loyal dog Scout, who returned alone after 1 year, injured and traumatized. But what really happened during that missing year? Why did Scout have fresh bandages? And what secrets did those Alaskan woods keep hidden? The answers will change everything you think you know about survival. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. It means everything to know we're uncovering this mystery together with the respect it deserves. Daniel, 54, worked as a senior park ranger with over 20 years of experience in Alaska's wilderness. Lisa, 49, was a seasoned veterinarian who had developed a deep love for animals and the outdoors. They lived in Anchorage and had been together for 8 years, building a life centered around their shared passion for nature. Every fall they took hunting trips together. It was their favorite time of year, a tradition that had brought them closer together each season. They knew the wilderness like the back of their hands. Daniel had grown up in Alaska, learning survival skills from his father and grandfather. Lisa had moved there from Montana after completing her veterinary degree, drawn by the raw beauty of the last frontier. Together, they were an unstoppable team outdoors, complementing each other's skills perfectly. Their friends always said they were the couple who could survive anything. At their age, they had accumulated decades of outdoor experience between them. Little did anyone know, this trip would test that belief in the most terrifying way possible. What they didn't know was that something in those woods was already watching them. Scout wasn't just any dog. The German Shepherd had been with Daniel since he was a puppy. Scout was 5 years old and had been on dozens of hunting trips throughout his life. He knew how to track game, how to stay quiet during hunts, and how to protect his family above all else. Lisa loved Scout almost as much as Daniel did. The three of them were inseparable, forming a tight-knit pack that functioned like a well-oiled machine. Scout had never spent a night away from his owners. He slept at the foot of their bed every single night, a loyal guardian even in sleep. During hunting season, Scout would carry small packs on his back and help retrieve birds after successful shots. He was intelligent, loyal, and incredibly brave. Other hunters always commented on how well-trained he was, noting the unusual bond between the dog and his human companions. But intelligence and training can only go so far in the wilderness. No one could have prepared Scout for what he was about to witness. October 15, 2022. It was a crisp Saturday morning in Anchorage, with the kind of clear sky that promised perfect hunting weather. Daniel loaded their pickup truck with hunting gear, camping supplies, and enough food for 5 days in the wilderness. Lisa packed Scout's favorite toys and extra dog food, making sure their companion would be comfortable during the extended trip. They planned to hunt in the remote Chugach Mountains, about 100 miles from the nearest civilization. Daniel had hunted this area several times over the years, but never with Lisa by his side. She was excited to explore new territory and experience a different part of Alaska's vast wilderness. They told Daniel's brother Mike they'd be back by Thursday evening. Mike carefully wrote down their planned route and camping spots, a safety precaution they always followed. The couple seemed happy and relaxed as they drove away from their home that morning. Their neighbors waved goodbye from their yard, watching the truck disappear down the street. It was the last time anyone would see Daniel and Lisa alive. But someone else was already planning to make this their final trip. The drive to the Chugach Mountains took 3 hours through increasingly remote terrain. Daniel and Lisa sang along to country music while Scout slept peacefully in the back seat, tired from his excitement that morning. They stopped for gas and snacks in a small town called Talkeetna, their last contact with civilization. The gas station clerk later remembered them because they seemed so genuinely happy together, a mature couple still clearly in love after years together. They bought extra batteries for their flashlights and some beef jerky for the trail. Daniel joked with the clerk about hoping to bag a big moose, while Lisa petted every dog she saw in the parking lot. They were acting like any normal couple on vacation, relaxed and looking forward to their time in nature. The mountains looked spectacular that day. The fall colors were at their absolute peak, with red and gold leaves covering the mountainsides like a natural tapestry. It was perfect hunting weather with clear skies and cool temperatures in the mid-40s. They reached their planned camping spot by 2 p.m., right on schedule. They had no idea they were being followed by something that didn't want them to leave. Daniel and Lisa found what seemed like the perfect spot near a small stream. The water was crystal clear and cold, flowing down from the mountain peaks above. Lisa filled their water bottles while Daniel began setting up their tent with practiced efficiency. Scout ran around the area exploring all the new smells, his tail wagging with excitement at being in such a rich environment. The campsite was surrounded by tall pine trees and thick bushes, creating a sense of privacy and peace. It felt like their own little paradise, isolated from the world. Daniel gathered firewood while Lisa organized their food supplies in bear-proof containers. They planned to start hunting early the next morning, hoping to catch game during the prime feeding hours. That evening, they cooked hot dogs over the campfire, enjoying the simple pleasure of a meal in the wilderness. Scout got his share of treats, as always, never forgotten in their outdoor adventures. Lisa took several photos of the sunset behind the mountains, wanting to capture the beauty of their surroundings. Daniel played his guitar and sang Lisa's favorite songs, his voice echoing softly through the trees. Everything seemed absolutely perfect in their little wilderness paradise. They went to bed around 9 p.m. with Scout curled up between them in the tent, providing warmth and security. But at 2 a.m., Scout's ears perked up at a sound that would change everything. Scout heard it first. A low, strange noise coming from the woods that didn't match any animal sound he had learned to recognize. It wasn't the call of an owl or the rustling of small creatures moving through the underbrush. The dog's entire body went stiff, and he started to growl softly, a warning that something wasn't right. Daniel woke up when he felt Scout trembling against his leg, the dog's tension immediately putting him on alert. "What is it, boy?" Daniel whispered, his years of outdoor experience telling him to take the dog's instincts seriously. Lisa stirred but didn't fully wake up, still exhausted from their long day of travel and setup. Daniel carefully unzipped the tent flap and looked outside into the darkness. The campfire had died down to glowing embers, casting eerie shadows that danced across their campsite. Everything appeared normal, but Scout remained on high alert, his breathing shallow and rapid. The forest was completely silent, unnaturally so. Usually you could hear owls hooting or small animals moving around at night, the normal sounds of a living ecosystem. But now there was absolutely nothing, as if every creature in the forest was holding its breath. Daniel grabbed his flashlight and shined it around their campsite in a slow, methodical sweep. He didn't see anything unusual in the beam of light, just trees and rocks and their scattered gear. After a few minutes of watching and listening, Scout seemed to relax slightly, though he remained more alert than usual. Daniel figured it was probably just a raccoon or porcupine passing through their area. He was wrong, and by morning, their peaceful camping trip would become a nightmare. Daniel woke up at 5 a.m., like he always did on hunting trips, his internal clock finely tuned after decades of early mornings in the wilderness. Lisa was still sleeping peacefully beside him, her face relaxed and content. Scout was already awake, sitting by the tent entrance like a sentinel, his ears moving constantly as he monitored the sounds around them. They followed their usual morning routine with comfortable efficiency. Daniel started the campfire while Lisa made coffee in their camping percolator, the familiar rituals comforting in the wild setting. Scout got his breakfast first. As always, the dog's needs taking priority. The couple ate granola bars and dried fruit while planning their hunting route for the day. They wanted to check out a ridge about 2 miles north of their camp, where Daniel had spotted fresh deer tracks the day before. Lisa was particularly excited about the possibility of seeing a moose, having never encountered one during their previous trips together. The morning air was crisp and clean, with frost covering their tent and the surrounding grass like delicate crystal. It was going to be a beautiful day for hunting, with perfect visibility and calm conditions. They packed their rifles, extra ammunition, and lunch for the trail, making sure everything was secure and organized. What they didn't pack was enough supplies to survive what was waiting for them in those woods. By 7 a.m., Daniel, Lisa, and Scout were hiking through the forest along a well-worn game trail. The morning sun filtered through the trees, creating beautiful patterns of light and shadow on the forest floor. Scout ran ahead about 20 yards, following interesting scents, but always returning to check on his humans. His tail was wagging constantly, clearly loving these wilderness adventures. Daniel carried his rifle and a backpack with their lunch and emergency supplies. Lisa had her smaller rifle, perfectly sized for her frame, and a camera to take pictures of any wildlife they might encounter. They walked quietly, listening carefully for any sounds that might indicate the presence of animals. The forest was full of life that morning, a complete contrast to the eerie silence of the night before. Birds chirped and called from the trees above them, and they could hear squirrels chattering as they prepared for winter. They saw fresh deer droppings and heard something larger moving through the bushes ahead of them. Daniel thought it might be a deer or possibly even a moose, based on the sound of breaking branches. They followed the game trail as it led up the mountain, their breathing becoming slightly labored as they gained elevation. After an hour of steady hiking, they reached a clearing with a spectacular view of the valley below them. Lisa took several photos of the scenery, wanting to remember this perfect morning forever. But while they admired the breathtaking view, something else was watching them from the shadows of the surrounding forest. In the clearing, Scout suddenly started acting strange again, his behavior completely different from his earlier playfulness. His nose was working overtime, sniffing the ground in tight circles, clearly detecting something that troubled him deeply. Daniel and Lisa watched their dog with growing concern, knowing that Scout's instincts were usually reliable. Scout had found something that made him whimper and back away, his tail between his legs in a display of fear they had never seen before. Daniel walked over to investigate what had upset their normally brave companion. On the ground, partially hidden by a layer of fallen leaves, were the scattered remains of another campsite. But this wasn't a normal camping spot that had simply been abandoned. The tent was completely shredded to pieces, as if something had attacked it with claws or knives. Camping gear was scattered everywhere in complete chaos. A sleeping bag was torn apart, with white stuffing blowing around in the morning breeze like snow. Lisa felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Who would leave a mess like this, she asked, though part of her already suspected this wasn't simple carelessness. Daniel examined the scene more closely, his military training helping him read the signs of violence. The damage looked relatively fresh, maybe only a few days old based on the condition of the scattered materials. But there were no signs of the campers who had been here, no indication of where they might have gone. What Daniel found next made his blood run cold. Hidden under a pile of torn fabric and scattered camping supplies, Daniel discovered a wallet. Inside was a driver's license belonging to a man named Robert Chen from Seattle. The license showed a smiling young man in his 30s with his whole life ahead of him, someone who had probably come to Alaska seeking adventure. But Robert was nowhere to be found, and the destruction around them suggested something terrible had happened. Lisa looked around the destroyed campsite with growing fear, her veterinary training helping her recognize signs of violence that went beyond normal animal behavior. "We need to report this to the rangers immediately," she said, her voice tight with anxiety. Daniel agreed completely, but they faced a serious problem. They were too far from any cell phone towers for their phones to work, and their satellite phone was back at their own camp, several miles away. Scout was still acting nervous, staying close to Lisa's legs and constantly looking back toward the forest, as if expecting something dangerous to emerge from the trees at any moment. Daniel took several photos of the destroyed campsite with Lisa's camera, knowing they would need evidence when they reported this to the authorities. They made the decision to hike back to their camp immediately and call for help using their satellite phone. But as they started walking back down the trail, Lisa noticed something that made her heart race with terror. There were fresh footprints in the dirt, large boot prints that were much bigger than Daniel's own size, 11 boots. Someone had been walking this trail very recently, maybe within the last hour, and they were following the same path back toward Daniel and Lisa's camp. Daniel saw the footprints too, and his expression immediately became serious and alert. The prints were from large boots, much bigger than his own, and they were deep in the soil, suggesting a heavy person or someone carrying a significant amount of weight. Daniel's military training from his younger years kicked in automatically. He had served 2 tours in Afghanistan in his 20s and knew when something wasn't right, when danger was present, even if you couldn't see it directly. "Lisa, we need to move quickly," he whispered, his voice carrying an urgency that made her stomach clench with fear. They started hiking faster than before, but tried to stay as quiet as possible, not wanting to alert anyone to their presence. Scout seemed to understand the urgency of the situation instinctively. The dog stayed between Daniel and Lisa, alert and ready for trouble, his protective instincts fully engaged. Every few minutes, Daniel would stop and listen carefully to the sounds around them, his senses tuned for any indication that they were being followed. The forest seemed to be holding its breath around them. No birds were singing anymore, and even the wind had stopped blowing through the trees. It was the kind of unnatural silence that comes before something terrible happens, when even nature seems to sense approaching danger. Lisa's hands were shaking as she held her rifle, the weapon feeling both comforting and inadequate at the same time. Then they heard it clearly, the unmistakable sound of someone moving through the trees behind them, following their trail. The footsteps behind them were getting steadily closer, and they could hear branches breaking as someone moved through the forest without any attempt at stealth. Daniel motioned for Lisa to hide behind a large boulder beside the trail, and they crouched down with Scout between them. They waited in complete silence, their hearts pounding so loudly they were afraid the sound might give them away. Through the trees they could see a dark figure moving slowly along the trail they had just traveled. The person was wearing all black clothing and carrying something heavy, though they couldn't make out exactly what it was from their hiding spot. Daniel couldn't make out any details about the person's face or build, but his gut instinct told him this wasn't a friendly fellow hunter out for a morning walk. There was something predatory about the way the figure moved, deliberately and purposefully, like someone hunting prey. The figure stopped at exactly the spot where Daniel and Lisa had been standing just minutes before, and for a long, terrifying moment, nothing happened. Then the person began moving again, but this time they left the main trail and headed into the thick forest, disappearing among the trees and shadows. Daniel waited a full 10 minutes before signaling that it might be safe to move, his military training telling him to be patient and careful. They hurried back toward their camp, taking a different route through the woods to avoid the main trail. Scout stayed close to both of them, no longer interested in exploring or playing, sensing the danger that surrounded them. When they finally reached their campsite, they discovered their nightmare was just beginning. Their campsite had been completely disturbed in their absence. The tent was still standing, but their supplies were scattered around the area as if someone had gone through everything they owned. Someone had rifled through their backpacks and food containers, clearly searching for specific items. Daniel's extra ammunition was missing from his pack, along with several boxes of rifle cartridges. Lisa's emergency medical kit was also gone, taken along with their first aid supplies and prescription medications. Most disturbing of all, their satellite phone was missing from the tent where they had left it. Their only reliable way to call for help had been stolen, leaving them completely cut off from the outside world. Lisa began to panic as the reality of their situation sank in. "Daniel, what do we do?" she asked, her voice shaking with fear and confusion. Daniel tried to stay calm for her sake, but inside he was terrified too, his mind racing through possible scenarios and escape plans. Scout was sniffing around the camp and growling at invisible threats, clearly detecting the scent of whoever had been in their campsite. Daniel quickly gathered their most important supplies, water bottles, remaining food, and their rifles with the ammunition they still had. He made a decision that would save their lives, at least temporarily. "We're not staying here tonight," he announced firmly. "We need to find a new place to hide, somewhere this person can't find us easily." They needed to disappear into the wilderness and figure out how to survive until they could find help or escape. But as they prepared to abandon their campsite, they realized they weren't alone in the area. A man stepped out from behind the trees at the edge of their campsite, appearing so suddenly that Lisa gasped in shock. He was tall and thin, with wild, unkempt hair and dirty clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in months or even years. His eyes had a strange, vacant look that made Lisa's skin crawl with instinctive fear. He was carrying Daniel's stolen satellite phone in one hand, holding it up like a trophy. "You folks seem to be lost," the man said in a scratchy voice that sounded like he rarely spoke to other people. Daniel immediately positioned himself between the stranger and Lisa, his protective instincts taking over. Scout was growling deeply and showing his teeth, clearly recognizing this person as a serious threat. "We're not lost," Daniel replied firmly, trying to keep his voice steady and non-threatening. "We're just camping for a few days." The strange man smiled, but it wasn't a friendly expression at all. It was the kind of smile that suggested hidden knowledge and bad intentions. "This is my territory," he said, his voice taking on a possessive tone. "Nobody camps here without my permission. I've been protecting these mountains for a long time." Daniel realized they were dealing with someone who wasn't mentally stable, someone who had probably been living in isolation for years. The man seemed to think he owned the entire forest and had the right to control who entered it. "We'll leave right now if you want," Daniel offered, hoping to avoid any kind of confrontation. "We don't want any trouble." But the man had other plans for them, and his next words made Daniel's blood freeze. "Nobody leaves," the man said coldly, pulling out a large hunting knife from his belt. "You've seen too much of my work. You know about my territory now." Daniel knew they had to act immediately. He grabbed Lisa's hand tightly and shouted, "Run!" at the top of his lungs. They sprinted into the forest with Scout racing beside them, his powerful legs carrying him effortlessly over the rough terrain. Behind them, they could hear the man crashing through the trees in pursuit, breaking branches and cursing as he struggled to keep up with them. Daniel's military training told him to find high ground and defensible positions where they could make a stand if necessary. They climbed up a steep rocky slope, using their hands to pull themselves over boulders and fallen logs. Lisa was in excellent physical condition from years of hiking and outdoor activities, but she was starting to get tired from the intense pace and the fear that was driving them forward. Scout seemed to understand that they were in mortal danger. The dog kept looking back toward their pursuer and barking warnings, trying to help his humans stay ahead of the threat. From somewhere behind them in the forest, they could hear the man yelling threats and promises of what he would do when he caught them. His voice echoed through the mountains, making him sound like a wild animal rather than a human being. Daniel spotted a cave hidden behind some fallen rocks and thick vegetation. It seemed like the perfect place to hide and catch their breath, until they discovered what was already inside. The cave was much larger than it appeared from the outside, extending back into the mountain farther than Daniel's flashlight could illuminate. He used the beam to explore the interior while Lisa caught her breath and tried to calm her racing heart. What they found inside made them both gasp in absolute horror. The cave was filled with camping gear, personal belongings, and clothes that clearly didn't belong to their pursuer. These weren't the possessions of someone living rough in the wilderness. These were trophies taken from other victims, evidence of crimes that had been committed over a long period of time. Daniel found at least 6 different driver's licenses scattered among the belongings, including Robert Chen's license from the destroyed campsite. There were licenses for 2 women and 3 more men, all from different states across the country. Some of the camping gear looked expensive and relatively new, suggesting recent victims. Other items were old and weathered, indicating that these crimes had been going on for years, possibly decades. This man had been killing campers and hikers for a very long time, taking their possessions as souvenirs of his murders. Lisa started crying when she realized the full extent of what they had stumbled into, the knowledge that they had walked into the territory of a serial killer. Scout was whimpering and trying to pull them back toward the cave entrance, his instincts telling him this was not a safe place to hide. Outside the cave they could hear their pursuer getting closer, his voice carrying through the forest as he called their names. He had gone through their belongings at the campsite and found their identification, making this personal now. They were trapped in a killer's lair with nowhere left to run. Daniel knew they couldn't stay in the cave any longer. It was too dangerous, and eventually the killer would find them there anyway. He also knew they couldn't outrun someone who had been living in these woods for years and knew every trail and hiding spot. They needed a completely different strategy if they were going to survive. Daniel had an idea, but it was extremely risky and would require them to separate. "Lisa, I need you to trust me completely," he whispered urgently. "I'm going to create a distraction to draw him away from here. When you hear me yell, you and Scout run back toward the main trail as fast as you can. Don't stop for anything, and don't look back." Lisa didn't want to leave Daniel alone to face this madman, but she knew he was their best chance for survival. He had military training and combat experience from his time in Afghanistan. If anyone could handle this dangerous situation, it was Daniel. Daniel gave Lisa his extra ammunition and kissed her forehead gently. "I love you more than anything," he said. "Now go hide behind those rocks near the cave entrance and wait for my signal." Scout seemed to understand the plan instinctively. The loyal dog stayed close to Lisa, ready to protect her with his life if necessary. Daniel's plan was about to put him face to face with a madman who had been killing people for decades. Daniel carefully climbed to the top of the rocky slope above the cave, moving as quietly as possible to avoid detection. From his elevated position, he could see the killer searching through the trees below, moving methodically and checking every possible hiding spot with the patience of an experienced hunter. The man was moving in a systematic pattern, using techniques that suggested he had done this many times before. Daniel picked up the largest rock he could handle and threw it as far as he could in the opposite direction from where Lisa was hiding. The rock crashed through the trees and underbrush, making a tremendous amount of noise that echoed through the forest. The killer immediately turned toward the sound and started running in that direction, moving faster than Daniel had expected for someone his age. Daniel waited until the man was completely out of sight before giving Lisa the signal they had agreed upon. She and Scout began running toward the main trail, just as they had planned, moving as quickly and quietly as possible through the dense forest. But Daniel's plan hit a serious snag when the killer realized he had been tricked. The man let out an angry roar of frustration that echoed through the mountains like the cry of a wounded animal. He started running back toward the cave area, moving much faster than Daniel had anticipated. Daniel realized he had seriously underestimated how cunning and experienced his opponent was. The killer was now positioned between Daniel and Lisa, cutting off any chance of them reuniting quickly. Daniel could hear Scout barking in the distance, which meant Lisa was still alive and continuing to move toward safety. But the barking also meant the killer could potentially track them by following the sound of the dog's voice. Daniel made another quick decision to protect his wife and their faithful companion. He started yelling and making as much noise as possible to draw the killer's attention back to himself and away from Lisa and Scout. The strategy worked exactly as he had hoped. The man turned around and began chasing Daniel instead of pursuing Lisa and Scout toward the main trail. Daniel was a good runner, staying in excellent physical condition despite being in his mid-50s, but the killer had a significant advantage. He knew every trail, shortcut, and hiding spot in these mountains after living here for years. It was like playing a deadly game of cat and mouse, with Daniel trying to stay ahead of someone who knew the terrain far better than he did. Daniel ran for over an hour, using every survival trick he had learned during his military service and decades of outdoor experience. He crossed streams to hide his scent from tracking, climbed over rocks to avoid leaving clear footprints, and doubled back on his own trail multiple times to confuse his pursuer. But eventually, exhaustion began to catch up with him, and his legs started to feel heavy and slow. When Daniel finally stopped to rest behind a large fallen tree, he realized he had become completely lost in the vast wilderness. This is how Daniel and Lisa got separated during that terrifying year, each fighting for survival in different parts of the unforgiving Alaskan mountains. Meanwhile, Lisa and Scout were following what they hoped was the main trail back to the road where they had parked their truck. But after several hours of walking through increasingly unfamiliar terrain, Lisa realized she had taken a wrong turn somewhere along the way. Nothing around them looked familiar anymore, and every tree seemed identical in the dense forest. The sun was starting to set behind the mountains, and the temperature was dropping rapidly as night approached. Lisa had Daniel's extra ammunition, but no food or water, having left everything behind in their desperate escape from the killer. Scout was clearly thirsty and tired from their long ordeal, but he stayed loyally by her side, never complaining or slowing down. They found a small stream where Scout could drink his fill, and Lisa refilled her water bottle with the cold, clear mountain water. She tried to remember all the survival lessons Daniel had taught her over the years. Stay calm and think clearly, conserve your energy for when you really need it, and keep moving toward civilization whenever possible. But which direction was civilization? Every tree looked exactly the same in the growing darkness, and she had lost all sense of direction during their frantic escape. Lisa decided to build a small shelter for the night using branches and leaves. She created a simple lean-to structure against a large tree, providing some protection from the wind and cold. Scout curled up next to her for warmth, his body heat helping to keep them both comfortable. During the night, Lisa heard sounds in the darkness that made her realize the killer was still out there somewhere, still hunting for them. For the next several days, the deadly game of hide-and-seek continued across the vast wilderness. Daniel was using every survival skill he had learned during his military service and decades of outdoor experience. He found sources of fresh water, caught fish with improvised traps made from sticks and stones, and slept in different hiding spots each night to avoid being tracked. But the killer was absolutely relentless in his pursuit. Daniel could hear him moving through the forest at all hours, always searching, always getting closer to finding his prey. The killer seemed to know the wilderness like his own backyard, moving through the terrain with an ease that spoke of years or even decades of experience. He had traps and hiding spots established throughout the area, a network of resources that gave him a tremendous advantage. On the fourth day of this deadly chase, Daniel found another one of the killer's camps, hidden in a thick grove of trees. This one had a crude but effective shelter made from logs and animal skins, showing considerable skill in wilderness survival. Inside the shelter, Daniel found more evidence of the man's crimes accumulated over many years. There were journals written in messy, erratic handwriting, describing years of attacks on campers and hikers in disturbing detail. The man saw himself as the protector of the wilderness, eliminating people who didn't belong in his territory according to his twisted logic. Daniel was about to discover just how far this madman would go to protect what he considered his domain. Lisa and Scout had been surviving on stream water and wild berries for almost a week, carefully identifying edible plants using knowledge Lisa had gained from her veterinary training and outdoor experience. Lisa was getting noticeably weaker from the lack of proper nutrition, but Scout seemed to be holding up better than expected. Dogs are naturally good at surviving in the wild, and Scout's hunting instincts were helping to keep them both alive. Scout managed to catch small animals like rabbits and squirrels, using skills he had developed during their many hunting trips. Lisa tried to cook the meat over small fires, but she was constantly afraid that the smoke would give away their location to their pursuer. They kept moving during the day, always hoping to find a road, another group of campers, or any sign of civilization. Lisa's feet were covered in painful blisters from walking in hiking boots that weren't designed for this kind of extended trek. Her clothes were torn from pushing through thick bushes and climbing over rocks, but she absolutely refused to give up, driven by her love for Daniel and her determination to survive. She knew in her heart that Daniel was still alive somewhere in these mountains, still fighting his own battle for survival. Scout seemed to sense her determination and drew strength from it. The intelligent dog would scout ahead on the trail, then come back to guide Lisa along the safest paths through the difficult terrain. On the seventh day of their ordeal, Lisa made a discovery that would change everything. Deep in the forest, Lisa found an old hunting cabin that looked like it hadn't been used for several years. The structure was weathered and covered with moss, but it appeared to be sound and dry inside. The windows were boarded up with old plywood, and the door was secured with a rusty padlock. But it represented shelter and possibly supplies that could help them survive. Lisa broke the lock on the door using a large rock and went inside with Scout close behind her. The cabin contained basic survival supplies that previous hunters had left behind: canned food that was still good, warm blankets, and most importantly, a two-way radio that might allow them to call for help. Lisa's hands were shaking with excitement and hope as she tried to use the radio to contact the outside world. But when she turned it on, all she heard was static and electronic noise. She searched through the cabin systematically and found some old batteries in a drawer, though she wasn't sure if they would still work after sitting unused for so long. Her hands were trembling as she replaced the batteries in the radio, praying that this might be their salvation. When she turned the radio on again, she tried different channels, calling Mayday and help over and over into the microphone. Just when she was about to give up hope, a voice crackled through the static. It was a park ranger responding to her emergency call, the first human contact they had had in over a week. But before Lisa could explain their situation and provide their location, the radio went dead again, leaving her in silence. Lisa spent the next several hours desperately trying to get the radio working again. She found more batteries and tried different combinations, hoping to find a set that would provide enough power for reliable communication. Sometimes she could hear voices faintly through the static, but they couldn't hear her responses clearly enough to understand her situation. The radio was simply too old and damaged to work properly for extended periods. Lisa realized with growing despair that the ranger she had briefly contacted might think it was just a false alarm or equipment malfunction. Nobody would be coming to rescue them based on that brief, unclear contact. Scout seemed to sense Lisa's despair and disappointment. The loyal dog rested his head on her lap and looked up at her with understanding eyes, providing comfort in the only way he could. Lisa cried for the first time since their ordeal began, finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of their desperate situation. She missed Daniel terribly and wondered constantly if he was still alive somewhere in the vast wilderness. The cabin had an old calendar on the wall from 2018, and Lisa counted the days since they had first arrived in the mountains for their hunting trip. It had been 2 full weeks of running, hiding, and barely surviving on whatever they could find. But despite everything they had endured, Lisa made a firm decision that night as she held Scout close for warmth. She would not give up hope, no matter how desperate things seemed. The next morning, Lisa discovered she and Scout were no longer alone at the cabin. Lisa woke up to the sound of Scout's low, warning growl, the same sound he had made on their first night when danger was approaching their campsite. Through the cabin window, she could see a dark figure moving around outside, examining the area for signs of recent activity. It was him, the killer who had been hunting them for 2 weeks, finally tracking them down to what she had hoped was a safe refuge. Lisa grabbed her rifle and quietly loaded it with steady hands. Her movements were much more confident now than they had been at the beginning of this ordeal. 2 weeks of survival had made her stronger, more focused, and more determined than she had ever been in her life. The killer was carefully examining the cabin, looking for signs of recent use that would confirm his suspicions. Lisa had been careful to hide most evidence of their presence, but Scout's distinctive paw prints were clearly visible in the muddy ground near the door. The man started walking directly toward the cabin entrance, his intentions obviously hostile. Lisa knew she had 2 choices: hide inside the cabin and hope he would leave without finding them, or face him directly and end this deadly game once and for all. She thought about Daniel and all the innocent people this man had killed over the years, their belongings stored in his cave like trophies from a hunting expedition. Lisa made her choice with grim determination. She opened the cabin door and stepped outside with her rifle raised and ready. What happened next would determine whether Lisa and Scout would ever see Daniel again. "Stop right there," Lisa commanded, her voice much stronger and more confident than she felt inside. The killer looked genuinely surprised to see her standing there armed and ready to fight. He had probably expected to find a scared, helpless victim cowering in fear. Instead, he found a woman who had learned to fight for her life and wasn't going to surrender without a battle. Scout stood beside Lisa in a protective stance, ready to attack if their confrontation turned violent. The killer smiled his cold, emotionless smile that had no warmth or humanity in it. "You can't hide forever," he said in his scratchy voice. "This is my forest, and you don't belong here." Lisa kept her rifle pointed directly at his chest, her finger on the trigger and ready to fire. "Where is my husband?" she demanded, her voice filled with determination and barely controlled anger. The killer's smile grew wider, clearly enjoying the psychological game he was playing. "Your husband is feeding the bears by now," he lied, trying to break her spirit and make her give up. But Lisa didn't believe him for a second. She had survived too much and endured too many hardships to give up hope now. "You're lying," she said firmly. "Daniel is alive, and I'm going to find him." The killer started moving closer, his hand drifting toward the knife on his belt. Lisa knew she had only seconds to act. She steadied her breathing, braced herself, and fired. The sound of the rifle shot tore through the stillness, echoing across the forest like a cannon blast. The man staggered backward, clutching his shoulder. Lisa had hit her mark, not a fatal shot, but enough to stop him. He collapsed onto the ground with a scream of rage and pain. Scout lunged forward, barking furiously, ensuring the man stayed down. Lisa rushed forward, kicked the knife out of the killer's reach, and threw it deep into the forest. She grabbed his pack and found food, a map, and more disturbing mementos taken from other victims. Blood was soaking through the killer's shirt, but Lisa didn't care to offer aid. "If you follow me again," she said coldly, "I won't miss next time." With Scout by her side, she turned and disappeared into the forest. What Lisa didn't realize was that the gunshot had been heard by someone else, someone who had been searching these woods for days, calling her name into the emptiness. Miles away, Daniel froze mid-step. The unmistakable sound of a rifle cracked through the trees. It echoed from the north, not far from where he had hoped Lisa might have gone. It couldn't have been a coincidence. It had to be her. He took off running in the direction of the sound, his heart pounding. His body ached from injuries and exhaustion, but adrenaline carried him forward. Daniel was filthy, bruised, and starving, but the possibility that Lisa was alive gave him strength. He shouted her name as he ran, dodging fallen branches and ducking under limbs. "Lisa!" he called again, louder this time. Then, faintly, like a miracle, he heard it. "Daniel!" He broke into a full sprint, crashing through the last line of trees until he saw her. Lisa, still holding the rifle, with Scout racing ahead, barking with joy. They collided in a tangle of limbs and tears, clutching each other in disbelief. For several minutes, they said nothing, just held on as tightly as they could. Scout barked and danced around them, tail wagging furiously. Daniel finally pulled back and looked at her. "I thought I lost you." "You almost did," she whispered, "but I never stopped believing." Their reunion was short-lived. Lisa explained everything in rapid, breathless words. The cabin, the radio, the killer. Daniel's face darkened when he realized the man who had hunted them for weeks was still alive, even if wounded. They needed to move fast. They gathered what supplies they could carry, helped each other navigate the forest, and followed Lisa's vague memory of the ranger's radio response. The plan was simple: get back to civilization, get help, and end this nightmare for good. But as they hiked downhill, exhausted but hopeful, they came across something unexpected. A body, but not the killer's. It was a woman, barely conscious, emaciated. Lisa rushed to her side, checking her pulse. She was alive. "Who are you?" Lisa asked gently. "Sarah," the woman croaked. He caught me 3 days ago." Daniel's face paled. The killer had taken more victims. Lisa used her veterinary skills to stabilize Sarah as best she could. They gave her water, shared food, and promised she'd be okay. Sarah's car, she said, was only a few miles west. If they could get her there, she'd survive. But first, they had to get her out alive. They built a crude stretcher using broken branches and their remaining gear. It wasn't ideal, but Sarah was too weak to walk on her own. Daniel and Lisa took turns carrying the weight, moving slowly but steadily through the uneven forest terrain. Scout stayed close, alert to every sound, every scent. The dog's instincts were razor-sharp now, and his ears perked at the slightest rustle. Hours passed, the forest thickened, and the temperature began to drop. They pressed on, fueled by sheer willpower. Every step was agony for Daniel, whose injuries from his separation days earlier had only gotten worse, but the thought of saving one more life and protecting Lisa kept him going. Just before dusk, they reached a ridge that overlooked the area Sarah had described. At the base of the slope, partially hidden by trees and brush, was a dark green SUV, her vehicle. Relief washed over all three of them. Daniel set down the stretcher, breath ragged. Lisa helped Sarah into the back seat, while Daniel searched for the keys, which were thankfully still inside. They loaded up and started driving, the path bumpy and narrow but manageable. Scout sat up front, ears twitching, nose against the cracked window. Then he growled. It started low, like a warning. Lisa turned sharply. Daniel looked in the rearview mirror. Something moved in the trees. The killer had followed them. Even wounded, he had tracked their scent, their path, their every move. He was limping, barely able to hold up his left arm, but his eyes were locked on the car, full of rage, desperation. Daniel didn't wait. He slammed his foot on the gas, gravel spinning beneath the tires. The SUV lurched forward down the uneven path, jostling everyone inside. Lisa clutched Sarah in the back seat while Scout barked wildly, but the killer wasn't giving up, not yet. A gunshot rang out. The back window shattered. Lisa screamed and ducked instinctively, shielding Sarah. Daniel kept his eyes on the road, weaving around trees and brush as fast as the terrain would allow. They drove for miles in silence, except for the ragged breathing, Scout's growls, and Sarah's faint moaning. Eventually, they reached the edge of a main logging road, wide enough to move faster. Daniel turned right and floored it. In the distance, they saw it. A ranger's truck, parked, lights on. They honked, flashed their headlights, waved arms out the window. The truck's door opened and a uniformed woman stepped out. Daniel skidded to a stop. Lisa jumped out, yelling, "Help! She's injured! He's still out there!" The ranger immediately called for backup. Within 20 minutes, more vehicles and 2 ambulances arrived. Sarah was taken on a stretcher. Lisa and Daniel were checked for injuries. Scout was given water and a blanket by one of the rescue workers. Then, as Lisa sat on the bumper of the ranger's truck shaking, Daniel came over. "It's over," he said softly. "We made it." Lisa looked up at him, eyes full of tears. "Are you sure?" she whispered. Because deep down, both of them felt it. It wasn't really over. And they were right. At the hospital, Daniel underwent surgery to repair the damage done by weeks of physical trauma and a near-constant adrenaline rush. Lisa stayed at his bedside day and night, refusing to leave, even when nurses gently encouraged her to rest. Her own body was bruised, her muscles sore, her hands scratched and raw, but none of it mattered compared to knowing that Daniel was alive, and Scout had stayed safe. Sarah, too, was recovering in a separate wing. Doctors said she'd pulled through thanks to Lisa's quick thinking and basic medical intervention. It would take weeks for her body to rebuild its strength, but she was going to survive. After 3 days in recovery, Daniel was finally stable enough to talk to investigators. Detective Maria Rodriguez, a veteran with the Anchorage Police Department, sat beside his hospital bed, a notebook in hand. Daniel and Lisa told her everything, about the stalker in the woods, the destroyed campsites, the cave filled with victims' belongings, and the journals describing the man's twisted mission. Lisa even handed over the photos from the camera she'd managed to keep through the ordeal. Detective Rodriguez listened without interruption, her face unreadable. When they finished, she closed her notebook carefully. "We've been chasing stories about a wild man in the Alaskan interior for over a decade," she said quietly. "Campers disappearing without a trace, supplies going missing, sightings, but no one ever believed the rumors until now." Search teams were dispatched immediately. The coordinates Lisa remembered from the cave, the trail markers Daniel had etched into trees, even the hunter's cabin. They followed every lead. And what they found was beyond what anyone expected. 7 separate sites, each one bearing evidence of human presence, some recent, some frighteningly old, personal belongings, journals, IDs, dozens of them. Over the course of several weeks, authorities uncovered evidence of at least 43 different victims, hikers, campers, hunters. Some had been reported missing in Alaska, others from out of state, lured by the dream of the wild and never seen again. The killer, it turned out, had a name, Marcus Webb, declared legally dead 12 years earlier after disappearing from a mental health facility in Oregon. No one had suspected he was alive, certainly not hiding in the Alaskan mountains, building an empire of death under the guise of solitude and twisted purpose. According to his journals, Marcus believed he was the guardian of the forest, eliminating outsiders who disrespected the land. The items he kept weren't trophies, they were warnings in his mind, a message to others. Daniel and Lisa had narrowly escaped becoming part of that warning. But just when they thought they could finally breathe, another nightmare began. 6 months after their rescue, Daniel and Lisa were beginning to rebuild their lives. They had left Alaska, choosing to settle on a quiet ranch in Montana, far away from the shadows of those woods. Daniel had left his ranger position and was working part-time teaching survival skills to local kids. Lisa had opened a small veterinary clinic nearby. The trauma hadn't vanished, but time and distance were helping them heal. Scout had changed too. Once a fearless explorer, he now stayed close to the house. The dog that once chased deer through the forest now refused to step beyond the property line. He slept at the front door every night and barked at even the faintest noise. But despite the change in temperament, he was still their hero, still the dog that had carried them through the worst days of their lives. Then, one afternoon in early spring, Scout disappeared. At first, Daniel and Lisa thought maybe he'd wandered off and gotten distracted, the way dogs sometimes do. They searched the property, called his name, drove up and down the back roads. Nothing. Lisa barely slept that night, heart pounding every time she thought she heard a bark or scratching at the door. At dawn, Scout returned. He was filthy, exhausted, and bleeding slightly from one paw. But in his mouth, clamped tightly like a prize, was a piece of dark green fabric. Lisa froze when she saw it. She recognized the material immediately. Camouflage, the same kind Marcus Webb had worn. Daniel took the fabric and inspected it under the kitchen light. There were fresh bloodstains. Not old, not weathered. Fresh. They called Detective Rodriguez instantly. She arrived the next day, flying in from Anchorage after hearing the news. Scout led them, Daniel, Lisa, and the detective, into the woods several miles behind their property. He moved with purpose, nose to the ground, tail stiff and alert. What they found made Lisa's stomach turn. A hidden campsite, a tarp stretched between trees, a fire pit, cans of food, a small stack of books, and a journal, not Marcus's, Tommy Webb's, Marcus's younger brother. Tommy had been searching for his brother for years. But when Marcus's crimes came to light, Tommy didn't recoil in horror. He embraced them, obsessed over them, adopted them. He had been watching Daniel and Lisa for months, waiting. Detective Rodriguez's face was grim as she read through the journal. "He's trying to finish what Marcus started," she said. "You're not safe yet." Police launched a statewide manhunt, but Tommy Webb was already gone, melted into the wilderness, just like his brother had done. Daniel and Lisa were placed under protective custody, their home outfitted with cameras and panic alarms. But neither of them slept much after that, and neither did Scout. Because they knew that somewhere out there, Tommy was waiting. And this time, he wasn't hunting strangers. He was hunting revenge. Tommy didn't strike immediately. Weeks passed with no signs of him, no sightings, no stolen supplies, no strange noises outside the house. But that silence only made it worse. Because Daniel and Lisa knew exactly what kind of mind they were dealing with, one that was patient, calculating, and more dangerous than his brother had ever been. Unlike Marcus, who acted on instinct and obsession, Tommy studied his prey. He had read every article, watched every news report, memorized every word Daniel and Lisa had spoken publicly about their experience. He knew their patterns, their weaknesses, their fears. Police kept a watchful eye on the property, but Alaska's wilderness had taught Daniel one thing above all: killers like the Webb brothers knew how to disappear, how to wait for the right moment. That moment came 3 weeks into the manhunt. Jenny, Lisa's younger sister, had flown in from Oregon to visit. She wanted to offer support, help them heal, maybe distract them from the creeping anxiety that had taken over their lives. On the second day of her visit, she went hiking alone. It was a short trail not far from the ranch, popular, well-marked, and supposedly safe. She never came back. Daniel and Lisa called the sheriff. Deputies searched until nightfall, but Jenny was gone. Then they found the note, folded neatly and pinned to their front door with a hunting knife. It read, "Daniel, you took my brother. Now I have your sister. Come alone. You know where." The blood drained from Daniel's face. He knew exactly where Tommy meant. The old hunting grounds, deep in the mountain range outside Anchorage. The same place where it all began. Lisa begged him not to go. She wanted to call the FBI, wanted to send a SWAT team, wanted to do anything but let Daniel face another monster alone. But he knew that if they waited, Jenny would die. So he agreed to go, but this time he wasn't going unprepared. Daniel packed military-grade gear, including backup weapons, tactical maps, first aid kits, and, most importantly, a GPS tracker that linked directly to law enforcement. A delay in communication had almost killed them last time. This time, they'd know exactly where he was. Lisa helped him load the truck, her hands trembling as she zipped up his survival pack. "You come back," she whispered, holding his face in her hands. "You come back." "I will," he promised. Scout paced anxiously by the door, whining, ears flicking at every movement. Daniel looked down at him. "Take care of her," he said. Then he drove away, back into the forest, back into the nightmare. And what he found waiting for him in those woods was worse than anything he had imagined. Daniel arrived at the edge of the mountains just before nightfall. The trailhead was overgrown but unmistakable, the same one he and Lisa had driven years earlier, filled with excitement and love. Now it felt cursed. He parked the truck, strapped on his gear, and activated the GPS tracker. A tiny green light blinked steadily on his vest. He moved silently through the forest, senses heightened, every footstep placed with care. The trees were still. The wind had died. The air was thick with that same unnatural silence he remembered, the kind that warned of predators. After 2 hours of hiking, Daniel reached the meeting point, a clearing surrounded by thick trees just beyond a steep ridge. Moonlight spilled across the space like a spotlight. In the center of the clearing, tied to a tree with a rag stuffed in her mouth, was Jenny. She was conscious, eyes wide, terrified. Daniel's heart seized. Then, without warning, a voice echoed from the trees. "Nice of you to come, Ranger." It was Tommy. Daniel dropped behind a fallen log for cover. The voice had come from the tree line, maybe 20 yards away. He scanned the forest. Nothing moved. Then another voice, closer. "You came alone, just like I knew you would." Daniel spotted the faintest glint of metal in the darkness, a scope, a rifle. He rolled just as a shot cracked through the air. The bullet missed by inches, splintering the bark where his head had been. Tommy had set a trap. Jenny wasn't bait. She was a trigger. Daniel returned fire, quick bursts, controlled. He didn't want to hit Jenny, but he needed to keep Tommy pinned. Another shot rang out. This one grazed Daniel's leg. He gritted his teeth, pulled himself behind another log. Blood seeped into his pants, warm and fast. "You think you're the hero," Tommy yelled from the dark, "but you're just another intruder, another animal, just like the rest." Daniel's training kicked in. Slow breaths, focus, target movement. Then rustling. Tommy was circling to flank him. Daniel waited until he heard the next twig snap, then turned and fired. A scream, a crash, then silence. He limped toward the sound, rifle raised, pain blazing through his thigh. Tommy lay on the ground, blood blooming from his chest, still clutching his rifle. "You don't belong here," he whispered, coughing. "Neither of you did." Daniel stared at him, breathing hard. "You should have stayed in the dark," he said. Tommy's eyes went wide, then vacant. Daniel dropped the rifle, rushed to Jenny, and cut her free. She collapsed into his arms, sobbing. It was over, for real this time, or so they thought. Jenny was in shock, but otherwise unharmed. Daniel's leg was bleeding heavily, the bullet having clipped an artery. Every step back through the woods was agony. He leaned on a branch as a makeshift crutch, but it barely helped. Jenny stayed beside him, supporting his weight, whispering encouragement to keep him awake. Before they left the clearing, Daniel activated the emergency beacon on his GPS vest. The signal blinked red, live, and would transmit coordinates to law enforcement and search teams. All they had to do was stay alive until help arrived. It took 4 hours. 4 hours of darkness, freezing temperatures, and silence so thick it pressed against their skin. Jenny sang softly under her breath, songs she remembered from childhood, just to keep herself calm. Daniel drifted in and out of consciousness. Each time he came to, he mumbled Lisa's name. Finally, the distant thump of helicopter blades split the night sky. A searchlight swept through the trees. Voices called their names. Daniel and Jenny collapsed into the arms of the rescue team. Daniel was airlifted out first, unconscious and fading fast. The medics worked on him in the air, trying to stabilize his blood pressure as they flew toward the nearest trauma center. Jenny followed in the second chopper. Back at the hospital, Lisa had been waiting by the phone for hours. When it finally rang and she heard Daniel was alive, injured but alive, her knees gave out. She didn't remember grabbing her keys or getting into her car. All she knew was that she had to get to him. When she reached the hospital, doctors were already prepping Daniel for surgery. The bullet had done serious damage, and they needed to act fast. Lisa sat in the waiting room for 12 hours. Scout sat at her feet, unmoving. Finally, a doctor emerged with tired eyes and a half smile. "He's going to make it," he said. "It was close, but he's strong." Lisa broke down. After everything they had been through, Alaska, Marcus Webb, the year of trauma and rebuilding, Tommy had nearly stolen it all again, but he hadn't. Daniel had come back, and with him, a second survivor. Still, not everything was over, because the aftermath was only just beginning. Daniel's recovery was slow and painful. The bullet had torn muscle and grazed bone. He needed surgery to stop the bleeding, a blood transfusion, and weeks of physical therapy to walk without crutches. But he was alive, and Lisa was there every single day, helping him through every stage of healing. Scout never left his side. The dog had sensed the shift in their world the moment Daniel was hurt. During those long hospital nights, he'd curl up on the floor beside Daniel's bed, resting his head on the edge, eyes half closed but always alert. In the weeks that followed, reporters tried to get interviews. Their story was already legendary, the couple who survived one killer only to face another. The manhunt, the rescue, the shot in the dark. Daniel and Lisa declined every request. They needed peace. After Daniel was released from the hospital, they returned to Montana. Scout wore fresh bandages on one leg, Daniel's doing. While hiding in the mountains during the final chase, Daniel had treated Scout's paw himself with gauze he'd packed for emergencies. That detail, forgotten until now, resurfaced like a ghost from the past. It explained everything. When Scout had returned home months earlier, carrying that blood-stained camouflage fabric, he had been retracing the steps Daniel had once taken, retracing his loyalty. The bandages weren't from some stranger. They were from Daniel. Lisa remembered the day Scout had reappeared, his paw neatly wrapped. It hadn't made sense then, but it did now. It was Daniel's signature knot, the kind only someone with field medic training would know. The open loop finally closed. But one question still haunted them. Why hadn't anyone found Marcus Webb sooner? Detective Rodriguez had an answer. It turned out Marcus's territory had been farther reaching than anyone guessed. His journals had only scratched the surface. In the final weeks of the investigation, teams uncovered even more hidden camps, some dating back 20 years. Remote, buried under snow, or camouflaged so thoroughly that satellite imagery had missed them. There were bones, names, families who had never known what happened to their loved ones. Daniel and Lisa had walked through the heart of that darkness, and they had come out alive. Months later, on a quiet evening under a purple Montana sky, Daniel stood on the back porch with Lisa. Scout lay at their feet, finally at peace. The wind was soft. The air smelled like pine and dust. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. "I never thought we'd get to grow old together," he said, "but now we have a chance." He opened it, a simple ring, no diamonds, just silver, worn, honest. "Lisa, will you marry me again?" She didn't even need to speak. Scout barked once as they embraced. They had survived the worst of humanity, and in doing so rediscovered the best of themselves. This true crime story reminds us that some missing person cases hide darker mysteries than we could ever imagine. What began as a simple disappearance in the Alaskan wilderness became one of the most chilling, unsolved mysteries of our time. The vanished without a trace scenario that Daniel and Lisa faced reveals how quickly anyone can become part of a cold case file. Their story demonstrates that behind every missing persons investigation lies real people fighting for survival against unimaginable odds. From mysterious disappearances to miraculous rescues, this tale showcases the brutal reality of wilderness vanishings where people disappeared without a trace for months. Scout's heroic return proves that even in the darkest unsolved disappearances, hope can emerge from the most unexpected places, transforming what could have been another cold case mystery into an extraordinary survival story.